Hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp and I'm the Executive Editor for DataVersity. We'd like to thank you for joining today's DataVersity webinar, Monetizing Data Management, the latest installment in the 2015 year of the monthly webinar series called Data Ed Online with Dr. Peter Aiken, brought to you in partnership with Data Blueprint. Now let me give the floor to Megan Jacobs, the webinar organizer from Data Blueprint, to introduce today's speaker and today's webinar. Megan, hello and welcome.
Hi, Shannon, and thanks. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for finding the time to join us for today's webinar on monetizing data management. As always, a big thank you goes out to Shannon and DataVersity for hosting us. We'll get started in just a few moments after I let you know about some housekeeping items and introduce your presenter. We have a 1-hour presentation followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. We'll try to answer as many questions as time allows, but feel free to submit questions as they come up throughout the session. To answer the top 2 most commonly asked questions, yes, you will receive an email with links to download today's materials and the webinar recording so you can view it afterwards. These materials will be sent out within the next 2 business days. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. We set up the hashtag DataEd on Twitter, so if you're logged on, feel free to use it in your tweets and submit your questions and comments that way. We'll keep an eye on the Twitter feed and we'll include answers to those questions in our post-session email. Now, let me introduce you to our presenter. Peter Aiken is an internationally recognized data management thought leader. Many of you already know him or have seen him at conferences worldwide. He has more than 30 years of experience and has received many awards for his outstanding contributions to the profession. Peter is also the founding director of Data Blueprint. He has written dozens of articles and 8 books. The most recent is Monetizing Data Management. Peter's experience with more than 500 data management practices in 20 countries and consistently named as a top data management expert. Some of the most important and largest organizations in the world have sought out his and Data Blueprint's expertise. Peter spent multi-year immersions with groups as diverse as the U.S. Department of Defense, Deutsche Bank, Nokia, Wells Fargo, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and Walmart. He often appears at conferences and is constantly traveling. So Peter, where are you today?
After this, Lewis and I are heading in a car to Philadelphia. And I'm going to go spend a couple days working with everybody up there. So thanks, Megan. Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you again. Today's topic, we had our marketing people redo. That means Megan. And she said, no, monetizing data management is really boring. Call it show me the money. And it is kind of a good theme for us collectively because in the data management community, we do what we call support activities. And in that sense, we make everybody else in the organizations better, but means it's harder and it's not been something we've been practiced at, in other words, demonstrating specific value. So today we're going to start out and look at our usual data management overview. I'm going to talk specifically about some motivations that I had for the book here. And then we'll get into the concept of what does it mean to manage leveraging data. And then we're going to go through 6 monetary return on investment cases. But it's important to understand as well that if you're in an NGO or a charity or even a B Corp type situation, money may not be the most important thing out there. So I say monetizing because that's what the vast majority of people are interested in. But if you're in a situation, and I'll show you 2 of them, where money isn't the most important thing, then what we'll do is look at how that can also be affected by data management. And then finally, we'll finish up with a little legal case that's some of the things that I've been involved in and sort of accumulation of all these sort of things. Anyway, let's get started. And I always like to start out by talking about Maslow. Most of you remember from high school that if your food, clothing, and shelter needs are unmet there at the bottom of the pyramid, it's going to be very difficult for you to do any self-actualizing. Shannon and I joke a little bit because at the beginning of the presentations, we like to play some music and just to keep you guys low, knowing there's something going on the other end of this thing. And I can imagine some of those brilliant jazz artists that we were playing just a few minutes ago would not have had the time to self-actualize if they had lacked food, clothing, and shelter around that. And this is a lot like data management. I say that most people are after what's in the golden triangle up there. And we've been using this golden triangle for a long time, and the actual names in the golden triangle have changed over the years as we've been using it. But right now it's big data, it's data mining, it's analytics, warehousing, service-oriented architectures, whatever. But we all understand collectively that that just represents the tip of the iceberg, and that if you don't get the good founding structures, the good supporting practices, what we call the foundational data management practices at the bottom, you can do the other things. And these 5 practice areas are governance, quality, strategy, platform architecture, and operations. Importantly, too, is that all of these things are held together by what we call a weak link in the chain method, meaning that this foundation can only be as strong as the weakest link. In this case, I'm showing something like a paperclip holding together a chain that is clearly not as strong as the other 4 chains are in this, which means that it doesn't matter how good the data governance practice, the data quality practice, the data management strategy, and the data operations are, this particular organization has a weak data management platform and architecture. And therefore, the practices, the advanced practices, can only be as strong as the weakest link in this chain. So it gives organizations a good idea where to go and how to move towards this. I'll show you a little bit more on this, but what we tend to see is that the golden triangle piece tends to be focused on buying technologies. And I can't tell you how many organizations of the hundreds that I've worked with over the years where they've gone in and bought something, an MDM solution. And that solution, yes, they work, but if you don't know how to use it, we have the saying, a tool in the hands of a fool. What is really more important to concentrate on are, in fact, organizational capabilities. And yet, in spite of all of this, we still get companies that come to us and say, can I do these things without doing the foundational practices? And the answer is absolutely yes, you can, but it will take longer, cost more, deliver less, and present greater risk to the organization than if instead you build your foundational practices first and then try to get the correct technology there. Now, I mentioned the 5 practice areas. We're very thankful to the CMMI Institute, Carnegie Mellon's group, that has now taken these 5 areas, and you'll see there are different colored operations here, and put them into a framework that we can now start to understand as our data management maturity model. And again, my colleague Melanie Mecca and I will be at the Data Governance Conference in San Diego in the first week in June, I believe it is, and go through the data quality area on this in considerable detail, just to take one area and dive into it. But the foundational practices will have to do with managing the data coherently, professionally, and in a fit-for-purpose way that is done efficiently and effectively. So we're avoiding boiling the ocean and all these sorts of things, that we can implement the architecture and platform in very reasonable fashions and come up with a life cycle implementation all the way around on these. And as I mentioned before, there are some supporting organizational processes that we don't tend to address, but that still are important. If you take a meta view of this, data management, of course, is a supporting process to your organizational strategy. So we're down 2 levels in terms of how the organizations actually perceive us. Again, we can go into some of these at some other point in time. Another real important component for our framework for organizing these things is the DAMA Guide to the Data Management Body of Knowledge. I was president of DAMA for a number of years. Sue Hyens is now the president, and she is still working very hard on getting all of this done. The idea here is, though, this was only put together in 2009, and consequently we've ended up with just a realization that, unlike the accounting profession, which has been around for many, many millennia, that this data management stuff is still relatively new, and there are still contributions for each and every one of us to make in this. Now, our credo, if you will, is that we believe that data is the most powerful yet underutilized and poorly managed organizational asset. It certainly is underorganized too. We won't dispute that as well. Data is your sole, non-depletable, non-degrading, durable strategic asset. And from that perspective, we really have to understand that it fits in a different paradigm than most of the other paradigms that we've been using. I've seen on a number of boards and places and things that data is the new oil, right? It's the thing that goes through all of our pumps. I saw somewhere that it was actually, somebody said, no, it's not the new oil, it's the new soil. See, soil's a little bit cleaner than oil. That's okay. I've also seen this, data is the new bacon. Yes, there are T-shirts out there that say that. Megan, I've been told several times we need to get our hands on some of those. we'll see about grabbing a bunch of those as well. Whatever works is really what it comes down to, because collectively our business mission is to unlock business value by strengthening your data management capabilities, providing tailored solutions that work for our organizations. Building partnerships with the business is the only way we can help to get this successful. Let's talk a quick little bit about the book motivations, and I'm going to be engaging you all in the audience out there a couple of times today because we do measure things. We are, after all, a data organization. And we've asked questions over time, what percentage of your data management projects are successful and things like this. These are some numbers from our 2013 survey that we did. And you can see here that organizations define value in different ways. Some of it define it with customer satisfaction and engagement, profit, quality of services. All of these things are okay. There is no right answer. But then what are the most important aspects of these that go into here? And we asked what percentage of your projects were successful, and 75% successful. Only 29% of the people said 75 were successful. 50% of them said that, 27% said 50% were successful, and 25% that 25% successful was defined by 20% on this. So we want to get your feelings on this, see if we're making any progress on this as well. Similarly, we also want to find out whether your organization has a data-centric culture or data-centric thinking on this. And again, we see the vast majority in 2013 said no, really not. So if you're in that 31%, congratulations. It's a great place to be. Now, when you look at Amazon, and the book is out there on Amazon, and look at these, there's a couple reviews out there, which is great. I wanted to go through a couple of them because you've got a one-star review, and it's always good to confront those head on. My reason for purchasing the book was to learn how organizations are finding ways to monetize their assets. By that, I mean finding ways to generate income using their data sets or insights derived from those assets. The book really didn't talk about making money through data management, and that is correct, and we're real straight on that in the forward. What we really talk about is how to use your data more effectively and efficiently. And here's a 5-star review, then, just to contrast it. It's a book you can read cover to cover on an airplane trip or during lunch over a period of days. I'm very big on stories, and the book contains a lot of stories on how to evaluate data management. And that's really what it comes down to. Somebody says, why should I do this? The answer is you've got to be able to show them the money. I also wouldn't categorize it a how-to guide, but really brainstorming book. And what we're doing is we're putting some stories out there, and our hope is that some of you will start to share these stories, bring them to our conferences, contribute to the overall body of knowledge that we are putting together, because this is relatively new and we're all learning our way around. Now, the Amazon rank is 1.5 million of books from the top, but the real key is we're trying to help our community articulate the importance of what it is that we do, because if we can't communicate in monetary or other terms that are equally important to those that are managing the organizations, then it will continue to be a struggle for the role. So they're smart business executives, but they don't know that they don't know much about data, and they don't know that IT doesn't know as much about data as it could either. And so what we did is we organized the book into 4 parts. First of all, giving a unique perspective on the practice of leveraging data, and then giving 11 cases, we'll go through 6 of them today, where data leveraging has produced tangible financial results, and then 5 cases. I give you 2 of them today. So you're getting almost half the book here in this one webinar, where you get some non-monetary outcomes of critical things that are critically important to the C-suite. And we'll show the integration and the interaction of data management practices with both IT projects and with legal responsibilities as well. So let's dive in a little further and see what we mean by leveraging data. Most people are aware that data is a combination of a fact and a meaning. If I give you the number randomly, 42, it's not a very helpful number. If I tell you it's the meaning of life, the universe, and everything, you may chuckle a little bit and say, oh, yes, I read that book too. It was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. And in the book, the white mice and the dolphins who decide that they'd like to find out the meaning of life because they're running the world with us as the experiment, they create a gigantic supercomputer. It goes away and chomps on things for 300 centuries, comes back and says the answer to life, the universe, and everything is 42. Well, I've given you a little bit of blather there that is somewhat of a meaning relative to a fact. So perhaps the next time somebody says 42, you all may go, oh yeah, 42, that's the meaning of life, right? An equally irrelevant fact is 42 was my age 14 years ago. Do you care? No, of course not. But if you were trying to see whether I was old enough to buy liquor in the Commonwealth of Virginia, yeah, then maybe it would become a little bit more important. Now, just understanding that we can put data together out of a series of facts and meanings is not enough to get us business value. And we used to think that if we stopped at information, that was a good place to stop. Information is responding to the requirements that we have, the requests for information. Unfortunately, we've learned that things really have to occur in 3 times, and it's not simply enough to pair data with a request and provide it in information. We need to go 3 levels up where, again, just as that before slide I described to you, intelligence has been replaced by knowledge and wisdom in many cases, and find out what strategic use of this information is for in the organizations, and that this data and information must formally be arranged into an architecture in order to be leverageable at all. Leveraging is an engineering concept. With the proper techniques, a human being can lift something that is much more than the human being. Again, if you take it to extremities, an infinite set of tools and things could lift any amount of leverage at all in there. Now, if we look at this as data leveraging, then what we start to see is we have organizational data, and that is people on one end of this stick who are trying to do this type of work. And we can call the stick a technology. Okay, and we apply certain data technologies in here. We also have a fulcrum that we apply to this as well. And the fulcrum and the stick together make up the correct mixture of technologies for these people. Of course, we can't pull it all together until we have a process involved in this as well. So the people leverage the fulcrum and the lever and move the organizational data in support of organizational strategic objectives. We also want to introduce here a concept called rot, and it turns out that 80% of organizational data is rot. Rot falls into the category of data that is redundant, obsolete, or trivial. And if your data is redundant, obsolete, or trivial, it gets in the way of trying to do other things. Now, why is data management important? Well, too much data leads directly to this wasted productivity and a huge waste of manpower, money, methods, and machines around this. And the reason this is problematic is because we've had a tremendously incorrect educational focus. If you think about it, we teach young people how to build new systems. Those are not the people that you grab. As fine a university as Virginia Commonwealth University is, our graduates are not the ones you're going to take and build new systems with. You're going to train them. You're going to do some other things with them. So we really should be focusing our educational graduates on something else, something useful in this case. Similarly, business thinks that IT is taking care of the data, and IT thinks it's a business problem. So you have a mismatch in terms of expectations there. And finally, we have system development practices that we really teach incorrectly here. Again, data evolution is separate from, external to, and must precede system development lifecycle activities. Data really is not a project, and if you try to manage it as a project, you will have tremendous problems in order to do this. Let me give it to you in a slightly different way. When we create IT systems, they create a capability that the organization didn't have prior to the capabilities being created, whether it's being created with software that you purchase or something that you're building on your own. And that these data, however, remember, are superseding. They evolve over time. It's not a creation-oriented activity. It's a different form of life cycle. If you want to do this properly, you need to separate your data evolution from your development activities. It needs to be in a separate cycle, external to, and it must precede them. Many groups ask us all the time, how can we speed up Agile, which is a very promising set of ways of improving your technology at this point in terms of delivering software, and the answer is make sure the data is done before you start the Agile processing. See, the way in which we've taught this is what we call an application-centric method, and it means that when we start it with strategy, and then we come up with some goals and objectives, and then we build some systems, which seems like a very reasonable next step. Then we have discussions about networking, and finally the data becomes the last part of this. But the minute that you say systems in here, and I'll just pick on SAP, which is a very fine piece of software that works extremely well for organizations that know what they're doing with it, it sucks the air out of the conversation. There is nothing else to talk about. And the problems are that this ensures that the data is formed to the applications and not around the organization-wide process requirements, that the processes are narrowly formed around those applications, and very little data reuse is possible under these circumstances. Now, this is because our typical organization has evolved over time, and each of these silos, as we call them, has their own separate piles of data, and they work very well within a particular domain, work group, department, whatever the level of abstraction that you're working with is. But as soon as you try to start tying these things together, it becomes very problematic, and you win the game of Twister by not falling down, which is a very low standard in this domain. We'd like it to be easier. And of course, Einstein is the one who articulated it so well. The significant problems we face cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. So our data-centric mode here starts out in a very similar fashion. We, of course, want to be focused on strategy and then goals and objectives, but the next piece down would be what is our data and information layer that needs to occur. Remember, it must precede, be external to, and separate from our systems development activities. Because once we define the data, then that and that alone should drive the systems and applications to a much greater degree than the organizational business needs are. Because if you refine your requirements to data requirements, you have a much better, more precise, more testable form of articulated requirements than you do if you just have system requirements. The advantages of this approach are that the information system assets are developed from an organization-wide perspective, that the systems that support the organizational data needs and complement the organizational process flows, and that we can actually reuse the data that's in here. Now, I'm going to get ready to ask you all a question in a minute, but just to think about this for a quick second, most organizations are trying to reuse software, and yet when we measure across platforms, across industries, virtually none of software is reused. Sure, interface elements are all sorts of little bits and pieces. I reuse slides, right? But this does not get us to information reuse and certainly not to IT asset reuse. Data, on the other hand, is something that is designed to be reused. In fact, if you don't reuse it, there's not much point in keeping it in the first place. Imagine keeping a data item for just one use. So as mentioned before, we want to update our little survey there that I showed you at the beginning. So if you'll take a minute here and just tell us who or what departments make the decision investing in data management initiatives. Is it A, IT, B, business supported areas, or the IT and the business together, or D, do you have a chief data officer or enterprise data executive equivalent in here? I'll give you 42 seconds to do this, scientifically measured by Shannon. I lost my music. Hang on, where's my Jeopardy song? I'll find that for the next one.
All right, we've got a lot of answers coming in, so give it about a couple more seconds, and then we'll get some answers up for you guys.
I'll certainly let you guys take a look at it here.
Just give it one more second. All right, and they should be up.
Thanks, Shanna. Sorry, Shanna, Megan. So we've got 13% of you that are showing either Chief Data Office or an Enterprise Data Office. 26% make it together. I think both of those are good outcomes. Business area 8% and IT 17%. So thank you for that. We'll turn those in, compare them to the two, and we'll get it out there on a blog post for you all somewhere to take a look at. But look at those numbers and compare your organization to it, because it is good to be in that area in a way that you can specifically focus in on it. Well, I've given you a little bit of intro here. Let's dive into the cases, which is what everybody's really interested in. First case, time and leave tracking. Now, we subtitled this one, How to Find a Lot of Money Very Quickly, in this case, $10 million. The idea, first of all, was that we had a system that had, as an organization that was keeping track of time and leave for employees. And it was done at a statewide level, but with most large statewide projects, the data that was produced by the statewide reporting system was out of date and inaccurate. So the organization itself set up a internal thing. This was specific to a specific agency. And this agency then kept it on their own. Unfortunately, it was a very large agency, and it also produced a system that produced data that was inaccurate and not terribly relevant or timely as well. So we actually ended up with the work groups keeping track of their time and leave, which meant that every employee that was in there had to keep track on 4 separate time systems: the state system, the agency system, the work group system, and of course one of their own to reconcile the differences between all of those systems. Oh my goodness, I can see people's heads spinning out there. This is crazy, right? Well, we first of all decided to see what were the grades of the people who were doing that function. So we looked at the number of employees, you can see on the y-axis that were there. We looked at the actual districts that they were in, and we looked at the pay grade of those employees that were involved in it. And a natural question might come out, for example, that there were clearly 2 individuals that were grade 13s. And why were grade 13s doing what was clearly mostly done by clerical functions within these organizations? But that was not the rationale for this. We were able to say, for example, at the end of this particular phase of the analysis, that there were at least 300 employees that were spending, let's just say 15 minutes per week tracking time and leave for this organization. Great, okay, let's see what we can do with it. Once we have that information, we can take the pay grades, and we don't have to know what people make. We just have to know that somebody in an entry-level position at that particular organization was making X amount of dollars. Gives us the ability then to come back and say, okay, within that context, I'm just picking District L in this case, there were 73 people doing leave tracking, 50 doing time accounting, take the number of documents that they were doing, the timesheets per employee, how much time was spent on each one, what was the hourly cost, the fully loaded costs that were there, pull up those numbers together, come up with a semi-monthly timekeeping cost, and then bring it up to an annual cost for this district of $137,000. Now, we take that $137,000 and add that across each of the various bits and pieces here, and we were able to come up with literally $800,000 a month, or almost $10 million. So there's a very interesting way of simply looking at differences in productivity that improve data management could help. We don't need to fire anybody, change anything. We just need to improve the data management practices around there. And $10 million is a lot of money for many organizations. Next example, a company that produces lots and lots of chemicals and things, additives for cars, oils and fuels. They're trying to improve engine performance. This was a kind of a fun one because we told the guys in the shop that they had to wear white coats, and they were thinking, oh, cool, medical stuff. And it's like, nope, they actually have engines in the basement, and when they figure out a new engine formula, they go down in the basement and they try it out and see if they can get it to run. Now, they run lots and lots of tests every year, and these tests can cost up to $250,000 a piece. Well, that's a lot of money, and they didn't really have a lot of metadata. This was a room, if you will, of about 100 people who had a PhD in chemical engineering. Now, you've heard me sort of fuss about the general state of IT education in data management. What do you imagine chemical engineers are taught about data management? And the answer is, of course, virtually nothing. We were told actually we could stop at this point in the process because they said we never really had a really good idea of the workflow that was going through that process. But we said, no, we're here to deliver business value here. So we noticed that there was a series of processes and practices where a PhD in chemistry would take data, digital data from a digital computer system and turn around and retype that digital data into another digital computer system. I'm certain anybody on this call could have figured out how to do that better than these guys, but they were chemical engineers. They simply weren't prepped for that sort of thought process, and this is the way it had been done, so it was the way they were going to continue to do it, absent any guidance otherwise. They also had a Nike Nets where they would, move disks and USB drives around and things like this, all of which could have been improved by a workflow software. In order to do this, there was some manual data manipulation where people were cutting and pasting things that had to go out of certain cells because certain other spreadsheets couldn't keep track of it in this fashion. There were some places where we had to resolve some synonyms where people were calling things the same things that were actually different and vice versa on that. And there were also, of course, a whole series of tribal knowledge requirements that were embedded very much like our stored procedures in databases in a series of macros and batch files and exe files around the organization that you had to be knowledgeable that they existed because they were not documented anywhere around that. And finally, of course, the technology that they were using was not even necessarily one that had been Y2K approved of. And of course, we're so far beyond Y2K, it was a little scary at this point. But Fox Pro is not what we'd recommend, of course, for you to utilize in your organizations. Now, when you add up all of these things, again, this is a room full of chemical PhDs, very, very smart individuals doing terrific work, but they were not able to produce the results as fast. So we were able to help them reduce expenses, improve their competitive edge as well as their customer service, and get them time savings and improve their operational capabilities. And our client came back and said, my goodness, that was a $25 million gain in productivity that they realized in order to do this. I can guarantee you it didn't cost them $25 million to get to that improvement there. So a very, very nice opportunity here. I'm going a little fast. We can come back and revisit some of these during the Q&A if you want on this. Here's another organization that was looking at purchasing a software package to do their accounting, and their product was something that went into tanks. So they, of course, had to look at this. Now, the problem was that the software that they purchased was one that they considered every movement from every tank to every other tank to be a sale. And of course, in this organization, they wanted to differentiate between this. So they were faced with a choice of either modifying the software or doing something else. And of course, the problem with modifying the software package was that they would have had to modify the software package after each release every time it was done. Instead, they decided to put in place data governance and talk specifically about tanks at a two-level definition. Nobody in the department is allowed to use the word tank unqualified. There is a customer sales tank and an automobile sales tank in this case, but there's also a transport tank, a storage tank, a movement tank, and a flying tank in this case. And by differentiating those vocabularies, they then were able to implement a slightly modified accounting practice that enabled them to not modify the software, which saved them literally thousands and thousands as they were going through this process. Of course, they didn't want to get it confused with this type of tank either. Again, different story. We'll move into that one in just a second. And then, of course, there's the word tanked that we have as well that some people get this. Now, here's another customer that we were working with here that when you purchase a tank, it turns out that it decomposes into about 3 million unique data values. I'm willing to bet out there that most of you don't know which precise data value controls the obsolescence of that tank. And if the tank is obsolete, you wouldn't want to do anything with it. It falls into the same category as data rot that we spoke about a little bit ago. And we don't want to maintain them, we don't want to store them, we don't want to test drive them, we don't want to buy parts for them. And in the process of understanding this, we were able to help this organization put together about $5 billion worth of savings that got from basic practices of managing each of these areas. So again, just basic data management practices improvements led to almost $5 billion of equipment that they were able to go back and figure out a little bit better how to manage in these areas. Another quick example here, the group that is modifying and migrating data into a new ERP system. The original data were millions of NSNs, or as you probably know them, SKUs, stock keeper units. Those are just items. But here was the hitch. This data had been stored in a hierarchical database, and the hierarchical database had gone away a couple of years ago, and somebody had replaced it with an Oracle database that was made to operate as a hierarchical database. Very clever programming, so they didn't have to change any of the operational programs that were around it. It worked out very, very well, but now with all of this data stored in clear text comment field, it meant they had to have very strong subject matter experts, or in this case, tribal knowledge, to understand and how to use the data in this context. So in order to move it into an ERP system, somebody said we're going to have to manually go into each of these millions of NSNs or SKUs and extract the text manually, which meant the data structuring problem was completely unsolved. Luckily, at that point in time, I knew the senior executive that was in charge of it who had come to us and said, isn't there a better way than just having everybody sit down literally and manually do this stuff? And we developed what would now be called a text analytics process and converted the non-tabular data into tabular data. By the way, I really dislike the terms structured and unstructured because it's just so vague it doesn't help. If data was truly unstructured, that's the definition of data that cannot ever be structured. So they're making water out of wine as far as I'm concerned, or maybe it's wine out of water. I'm not sure which is the best way there. Here's the key, though, bottom line again on this focus area, is that there was a $5 million savings, and I'll show you how we got to that. But what I liked more about this one was that you've probably heard of person years. And we like person months, person days. This was the first time I ever got to a person century of work. So let's take a look at how this worked. Again, our text analytics process here, these were the numbers that we put up in order to look at this. So what you're looking at as we go down through this spreadsheet is that week 1, we sucked. We didn't match anything. And by the way, that's a very good reason why you need to manage the expectations around this particular process. But by the time we'd gotten to week 4, we had actually been able to match 55% of the items. We had solved more than half the problems in less than 5 weeks. Now, understand here, a week represents holding one end of the equation fixed. So this was really a team of 2 software engineers working 20 hours a week on the problem in order to provide them with a fixed cost that we could then look at the variable results and have something to take a look at. So the question at week 4 became not, is this a good approach, but should we, and how far should we continue it? And the answer was you should continue this until you get to the point of diminishing returns. So where do we get the diminishing returns? Well, one of the things I told you was the data rot. Turned out this system, we had identified by week 4, 12% of the data as being rotten at this point. Great, no problem. Again, should we stop? Well, we'd also found that we were unable to match 31%, dropping to 21, 20, and then back up to 32, which meant that the requirements were not yet stabilized. We did not yet fully understand the data requirements that had to be converted into this new ERP system. So I'm going to jump ahead 10 weeks, and now at week 14, our unmatched items had gotten down to 9%. We eventually got them down to 7.5% here. And you can see we went 9.02, 9.06, we went up to 9.53, back to 9.5. Again, if these things are varying, you don't want to do that. On the other hand, you at least can weigh it and say, is it worth another week's worth of person effort to put in on the other side of it? Also, notice what happened at the ignorable. By the time we got to week 14, we were certain as anything that this 22.6% of the data was just rotten and we didn't need it at all, and that our matched items had increased to 68%, going down a little bit, 67, and then back up again to 69, or 70% of the data. So if I take 70% of the data there, add it to 22.5%, that leaves only 7%. And instead of having to wade through millions and millions of items that were in here, we were instead able to say now there are less than 300,000 individual pieces being checked. I don't know about you all, but if I had a choice of 30,000. If I had a choice of being able to check 30,000 items versus 2 million, I would absolutely take that. Again, we need to quantify those benefits. So there's 2 million NSNs, 5 minutes to clean them. Let's add the number of available time for a resource to work in a year, and come up. There's our person year, 92.6 person years. So we'll round it up and just call it a person century. And the reason for that is because we looked at the SMEs, the subject matter experts here, as a $60,000 a year resource, again, rounding up to 93 years and $5.5 million in cleansing costs avoided in this case. But anybody out there that thinks they can do this information in 5 minutes, absolutely is no way. So what we ended up doing was saying, okay, double it. Now you're at 2-person centuries, $10 million. Triple it, maybe it's 15 minutes per. I don't mind. You can use whatever number. We know 5 minutes is probably not correct on this. So clearly we're looking at well over 300 person years, 3-person centuries in order to save this much money on a fairly standard IT project. I've got one more here in the monetary ones to show you, and this one requires a little audio participation, so just giving you a warning, I'm going to put it on speakers here. An excuse for a large sound system in your office. My office mates are gone for the day, so you won't have to worry about disturbing them. So what did we just look at? That was a way in which British Telecom articulated one of the values of the project that they were going to go into. And I'm going to run the thing again here, but I'm going to run it with the sound off this time just so that you can see and I can narrate the thing through here. So here's a great way of describing to everybody what we're going to do. Previously, information was stored in hundreds of databases across British Telecom. Very simple message. Processes were duplicated. Somebody says, oh my goodness, you just made one of those things, and I just made one too. Boy, that really not the best thing, right? And of course, that's a little understatement. It was all a bit messy. And then it says now we're sorting all of our data into what they call 7 sisters, the 7 master piles that they were going to put it into: user, customer, contract, inventory, product, price, and revenue. The point was that little animation came directly from the chief officer of the organization, who sent it out and said, hey, we're going to do something neat and new. And they invested 250 British pounds in having somebody illustrate that little scenario there. And in that illustration, it really was very easy for everybody to say, oh yeah, that's got to be an improvement. Whether master data management or not affects me, I at least understand what it is they were doing. So a very small amount of money invested in something that gave people an awful lot of understanding of the value. So those were our 6 monetary ROI cases. Again, we're going to go back to you all and ask you a question. Is it hard to obtain funding for your data management projects? Answer A, yes, because it's hard to show value. B, yes, because we've not aligned, obviously, with business objectives. C, yes, because no real precedent has set. Or what we're really looking for is, can anybody say, no, we've absolutely got the specifics that are there in looking at that. Again, we'll give you about a minute. Got it, Megan?
All right, answer should be up.
There we go. So, wow, only 3% of you said you do not have, you're able to clearly demonstrate business value. Well, again, I hope this is going to be valuable for you. Let's move on here now to some non-monetary cases. Again, many of the organizations that we work with are not concerned with dollars as their bottom line. So we'll pick a couple of examples here that are not. The first one's a really tragic situation. It's been referenced many, many times, but I want you to just picture a group of brave servicemen and women out in the field who are calling in a fire strike to something. And what they're doing is pointing at a suspected Taliban position. Well, we'll assume that they're right. It's a Taliban position, and there's an F-18 on its way to blow it up. Now, they take this GPS unit and they light it up, and they do this from a number of different perspectives, but when they light it up, when they point the laser at it, it makes sure that they're not going to drop the bombs in the right area. Now, all of a sudden, they notice the batteries in the unit are dead. They knock the batteries out of it, put some new batteries in, and the F-18 comes on and drops the bomb on them because the GPS unit reset itself, and when it reset itself, it absolutely reset the coordinates to the existing coordinates where it was. This is a terrible thing. Somebody should have been prosecuted, in my opinion, on this because the soldiers didn't know that replacing the batteries during a live action thing would cause the GPS unit not to go back to where it was, which is what we expect our devices to do, but in fact to broadcast its own location in order to do this. Again, here, this is a terrible, terrible situation where families were obviously severely impacted in this area. Now, is that a data management problem? Yes, it is. It's very easy to maintain, first of all, training around the data management practices that say, by the way, just a little bit of training. If you do replace the batteries out there while you're in the middle of something, make sure that you're not ready to call in the strike, or better still, replace the batteries every time you go out there before you start the process. Any sort of guidance here, people understand that and they would have done it, but here was a situation of unknown consequences, an absolutely tragic situation. Another one that we were very fortunate to participate in, you remember in 2010, people noticed that more first men and women were dying from their own hands than they were from bad guys. And so the Military Suicide Mitigation Project was one we played a small role in. Very, very happy to do that. One of the areas that we were in was a governance area, and we were doing mapping from various data sources so that we could get a handle on where everything was coming from and going to, and how we could use this data to start understanding how we could better help save the servicemen and women that were involved in this. Now, we had a room here that we called sort of the Council of Colonels. And again, this Council of Colonels were a group of people who would say things, well, my data from here can be used for this purpose, and my data from here can be used for this purpose. And another one would stand up and say, well, my data from here can be used for this purpose. And they were all correct in terms of what they were trying to say. We did have one chit that we were able to pull with the Army, and we were able to get a very senior executive to come in. Secretary of the Army came in and said, listen, I'm going to make an announcement here. It's from now on my data. Now, when you say something like that to a room full of colonels, they understand the chain of command, and they all stand up and say, yes, sir. And the gentleman continued and said, any future questions as to data ownership, they can make an appointment and tell me why our collective data, why my data can't be used to save the lives of our servicemen and women in this situation. Now, speaking to him later on, he actually said, I may or may not have had the authority to do that, but what, of course, he was trying to do was empower the team. It turned the conversation from can this be done to how are we going to accomplish it, and let people know that mistakes were going to be tolerated on the way, and that they were able to develop a workable communication system here. And again, very quickly, you can start to understand that a series of patterns and things, you are in fact able to recognize the situations that are coming up on this. Now we're headed to another question here as we get back to the top of the hour, but I do want you to understand as you're starting to fill this out, that if I could get the CIOs, CEOs that I work with to make a similar decision, to stand up and show the courage to say, it all now belongs to the company, or it all now belongs to this, it would solve so many of these problems, and it would make the monetizing process so much easier. Because notice in here, I've not provided any technical data management solutions for you. These are all things that many of you know how to do your own. We're just asking to do them better, more programmatically, and with a bit of guidance around them, as opposed to everybody trying to do it the best they can at the work group level, which is really how data management is practiced on this. So I'll give you another minute here to fill out the polling question here just to make sure we get it done. We'll get your data, take a look at it, and see what we come up with. Megan will just pop it up when we're done.
All right, the answer should be up.
There we go. Thanks, Megan. There you go. Cut the music off. So What percentage are successful? All of them 1%, 25%, 16%, 75%, 10%, none of them 4%. And some of you aren't answering. Come on, we need your information on it. I can't get to a statistically significant sample if you don't do that. But anyway, thanks for participating in that. One final example here that has to do with the legal domain. This is not where most people tend to think of data management savings here, and I'll just tell a little story. April of the year that we're talking about here, company X is going to implement an ERP, and they go to the ERP vendor and say, who's a specialist in this? Because we have a specific module. It turned out it was a time and pay module, but they were a temp agency. So the time and pay module implementation was going to be more complex than the typical one, and they said, we want a very special one. The defendant was indicated by the vendor to be a preferred specialist. They were the best in the area that could do this. And they'd gotten to July, they said, okay, they've contracted to implement this, convert the legacy data by December 31st. They didn't want to move into the new calendar year with the old system. No problem, they could begin the implementation on January the 9th, however. They realized that a project milestone had been missed, and they were not going to be able to do it. That January 9th will be significant in a little bit. They said, what's going on? And the company Y came back and said, well, you had bad data, so we had trouble converting it. They actually worked on the project for another 6 months, finally stopped paying company Y in this case, who then pulled their project team, and company X turned around and filed an arbitration request. Now, first thing, do not let your IT projects be governed by arbitration. It only works well for one party, and that is usually not who you are. That's a separate issue. If you want to ask questions about that later on, you can, but nobody thinks to look at this. It's generally a not good idea for most organizations. What was at dispute, though, at this point was who owned the project risks. Literally, who was the project manager? Was the data, in fact, of poor quality? Did the contractor company Y exercise due diligence? Was their method that they were using adequate? And did they follow the required standards of care? You all can picture the rest of the process here. We had a series of expert reports that proved that company Y's conversion code introduced errors into the data. Now, let me just stop here for a minute, because if somebody says they're going to convert the data and they haven't looked at it and they're going to tell you how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost, they're making numbers up. On the other hand, if you have somebody convert your data and you don't take a baseline sample of what that data looks like before, how are you going to defend yourself against the claim that your data is of poor quality? Again, a very issue. Some of the data that company Y converted was of measurably lower quality than the quality of the data before the conversion. We also introduced evidence indicating that company Y caused harm by not performing an analysis of their legacy systems, doing profiling as you would expect, and also withholding specific information that would have been important to the project. Now, not the quiz actually, but if you look at this and say if column 1 in source is M, then set the value of male, the worst thing that you can possibly finish that statement out with is else female. And the reason for that is because if you're only testing for males, it means anything not M is going to be female. That doesn't work when you have actually different types of values that you have to maintain by law. And this particular system was maintained in Canada, which means they had to maintain the Canadian Social Security gender codes of male, female, formerly male, now female, formerly female, now male, uncertain, won't tell, doesn't know, male soon to be female, and female soon to be male. By the way, the FBI maintains those codes as well. Again, I won the case just there because everything that was not male, female, formerly male, now me, female, formerly female, now male, all fell into the category of female, and we were able to demonstrate that the data was of less quality than original. Similarly, PeopleSoft, which was the ERP in this case, provided at the time a series of scripts to move things into their system, and the company Y here couldn't get the data to go in the first time, so they dummied out the parts of the PeopleSoft code that prevented it from adding duplicates. Now, some of you I know are cracking up. It was just sort of amazingly silly, but we actually questioned and said, so when we counted from customer database, there should have been about 6,000 customers. This was not an enormous data conversion process. And instead of 6,000 customers, they had 63,000 customers. And we looked at jobs that were out there as well, the employment category, instead of having 10,000, they actually had 100,000. So we were able to show, again, a lot of specific damage that had occurred. And this was in spite of the fact that the company had, in fact, identified the quality of the conversion data as a high risk in the original processing, the original thinking about it. Now, if you know anything about project management, you know that there's a subdiscipline called risk response. So here is how this company responded to the risks. The first two blocks that you see there labeled tasks and resources show a total of 320 and 280 hours of time devoted to the conversion. And they put a little clause in the product, in the contract that said the go-live date may need to be extended due to certain critical path deliverables not being met. This extension will require additional tasks and resources. The decision of whether to go or not go should be made by Monday, November 3rd. So that the resources can be allocated to the additional tasks. I already told you they didn't tell them that it didn't work until January the 9th. So bad for not following their process. But look at the penalty here. My goodness, instead of actually implementing the stuff on time with a total of 600 hours as they showed in the original plan, if something went bad, they would charge them an additional 2,840 hours. So we get paid more to mess it up or if it doesn't work than we get paid if it works perfectly the first time. Where's the incentive in that? Completely on the wrong side of the equation. We also had to demonstrate, because they did come back and say that we were not the project managers. The 100+ page document said, in fact, that the CIO was the project manager on this. And they were able to come back here and say, well, we weren't the project manager. But we were, in fact, able to look and see that they were doing things that project managers do, thank you to the PMBOK, the Project Institute Management Body of Knowledge, that is seen as a source on this particular piece. Company X did have some activities that were questionable about whether they did. Obviously, the weight of the evidence came back and showed that Company Y was, in fact, on that project. We're also able to demonstrate poor care on this. Here were versions of project plans that were done in this, and then I want you to just look at the right-hand column where it says total tasks, not the far right-hand column, next to the right-hand column, total tasks, and there's one line 3 from the bottom there. It has 2 from the bottom there, 499 tasks, and only 15 of those tasks had any predecessors. Now, that's a very badly managed project plan. It means that of those almost 500 tasks, all but 15 of them could have been done in any order, which we, of course, simply know is not correct on this. Or here was a absolutely wonderful set of time allocated to certain tasks that they were able to look at. This is a single person was going to have a very bad month. This was a 200-person week instead of a 40-hour week. It's just not going to work in that. And then we also asked the question, you know, where are the standards that they did? And they said, well, we provide certain standards. And we said, great, all right, where are those standards that you provide? And they went back and said, well, I don't know. There's nothing really written down, but it's recognized by consulting firms. And I said, no, you wouldn't know where they're not written down anywhere? And he said, no, they're not written down. Where would you look for them? And he said, well, I don't know in order to do this. So we were able to show again here that there was just clearly not a very good way of understanding this. So we've taken a very quick romp through the book. What I've done is, again, pulled up 6 specific cases where there's a tangible return on investment that says if you invest X, you will receive X plus something on the outside of it. And 2 that were not quantifiable perhaps unless you're willing to put a value on human life. Most organizations don't want to go there in that. And then I've talked a little bit about some legal considerations as well. Now, both of these are, all of these are in here where we've talked specifically about the state time and leave tracking, $1 million, the International Chemical Company, $25 million, the ERP problem that we looked at, $5 million, person centuries in this case, the British Telecoms, very small investment here, but it did in fact produce some very, very good non-tangible environments, and of course then the rest of these that come up. By the way, the legal case was $5,355,450 Canadian in damage and penalties in order to come up with this. So very, very quick romp through the book. Hopefully you'll find some of those stories interesting. More importantly, hopefully you all will contribute to this. And we very much would like to put a second volume together, expand the first set. Many of you are familiar with Enterprise Data World, our sold-out conference we just came off of month before last. And this is a perfect venue for bringing these things and trying to get them in front of larger audiences, because collectively we all need to work hard to help management understand that there is value in unlocking your organization's most important but poorly managed data asset. And with that, we turn it over to Megan for some questions. We've got a couple coming up seminars on this, and I already mentioned the Data Governance Conference we're going to be at in July. So it's your turn now, 3 o'clock. Let's go from here.
All right, now it's time for a Q&A, time for you all to ask your questions. So just click on the Q&A window feature at the top of your screen. You should be able to submit your questions through that Q&A window. And it looks like we've already had some questions come in. We'll go ahead and get started. Let's see here. First question is, oh, give me one sec. Let's see. What is the best method of showing ROI on data management projects to C-level executives?
So first of all, you've got to speak the language that they speak, which means it's up to us to understand what are the things that concern them in their meetings. If you go in and talk to them about best practices, and those best practices don't seem to them to relate to the business that they're trying to manage, they will show you the door. So I tell everybody to practice elevator speeches. Everybody knows an elevator speech is something that you get on the elevator at a floor and an executive gets on and they look over at your badge and say, Megan, you work for me here. Tell me what you do. And Megan, you better have a good story, because by the time the elevator stops, that executive is going to remember your name and one thing, good or bad. They're not going to think indifferent, right? So find out what are the buttons they're trying to work on. We always could go to data strategy. Another place, if you have trouble with understanding what the organizational strategy is look at their public filing documents. K1s and things of this nature will also be helpful in order to do this. The key is, if they don't see something meaningful in it and can't figure out how you're going to help them do something meaningful, then they think you belong somewhere else. So let me make it even more simple. If they don't understand what you do, you're a cost to them. If they understand what you do, you're an investment, and you very much want to come up on the side of the investment in that equation. If you're unable to say, I do this for you, and therefore things happen in a good way that makes this business more profitable, we save lives, we deliver more services, more goods and services to people, whatever the mission of your organization is, they're not going to appreciate the fact that they do it any more than a programmer is going to get appreciated coming into there. They might say, oh, you created this, that's nice, but they think a programmer is just kind of interchangeable as it is. So you have to be able to show that business value, and that's really it. So I know it's a vague question and a vague answer, but again, I hope you take away that that's a really important piece.
Okay, and the next question is, when is the best time to engage in new data management projects?
Is the best time to engage in new data management projects?
Yes.
Wow. I'm not sure there's a good answer for that. I mean, I would very much, for example, rather have, and you saw that earlier in the systems development lifecycle portion of this, I would very much rather have data management projects not being done as a part of IT projects. So let me just answer it that way. Get over to this slide here. If you're trying to do data management while somebody is developing system components correctly are managed as projects. And data not being a project has a very difficult time being able to respond. It runs at a different cadence, a different rate, a different set of deliverables, a different set of dependencies in this case. So, I mean, the only time you really start on a brand new data management project is when you start with a clean slate in part of the organization. Let me give you another story, though. Maybe this will help on there. And if I'm not answering your question right, please respond back and let's try and get it more correct. But one of the other stories in the book there is a bank that was working on a fairly large IT project, and they were managing it according to a standard IT management success. And they got to the end of the time, and they said the project is done. And the executive in this case said, well, let me just ask you all a couple questions. If it's done, how many of my customers are now covered by this new capability that you've developed for us? And they went back and looked and said, that's about 40% of the customers that we'd originally planned to be included in this are now included. She said, so you mean even though we're done, we're leaving 60% of the customers without this capability? And they said, yes, but the time is up. The project is over. And the executive pushed back and said, you know, why don't you guys go and put some more time and effort into this, and let's see if we can get it to 80%. And they did some revenue calculations and found out that by doubling the number of customers that were included in this capability rollout, it meant $50 million to the bottom line. So again, a very good example of why managing it as a project is generally not the right way to do this. If instead the data requirements had driven the rest of the system, then those requirements would have been part of it, and there's no way they could say the project was complete with only 40% of the project being done on that. I hope that answers your question. If it didn't, please jump back on the Twitter or whatever it is that you're doing and get us more clarity on that. Megan, what's the next one?
Okay, next question is, how do we decouple the value of data management activities from others such as project management, process management, network infrastructure management, etc.? Data management is just one of the activities to realize the value.
Absolutely, and it's a great question. So let's go back to this chart here, which shows that what's happening in this set of circumstances is those are all things that we would call supporting processes. And I would argue that data management in general is a supporting process to business objective attainment, as are those other projects. And this is, in fact, how we got the information that came into the book here, was by looking at the project management discipline. 20 years ago, somebody would not have known what you meant when you said you were a project manager. But thanks to the people over at PMI, Project Management Institute, they've put together a discipline. They've created a set of standards and an objective certification. And now you have either passed their certification or you have not passed it, which means you either are a PMI certified project manager or you are not. Similarly, DAMA has done the same thing. We now have a certified data management professional certification that you can have, and therefore your supporting processes, those things that were mentioned in the question, are all in that general category. Megan, read the question one more time because there were some very specific ones. I got project management in there. There were a couple of others.
Let's see, process management, network/infrastructure management, etc.
Okay, so those are two additional architectural disciplines. And by the way, we've done a fair number of measurements around that. Only 1 in 10 companies out there actually manages any one of those as a discipline. So if you're in one of those 1 in 10 companies, that's a great place to be. They do understand this. And there, for example, Nokia, when I was working with them, managed a process architecture and IT architecture. They had a whole bunch of different architects that worked as an integrated unit to try and do this. And one of the things they were trying to do was improve their data management practices around that same area. It's a terrific group of people to work with. They're a very smart company in order to do that. So when you look at these areas, that's what we did, is to get this information for the book. We looked at those areas and said, how do they demonstrate value? And you can see sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not. But the key is to start on this and to work your way into it. Because if I've given you 17 examples here, somebody else is going to come along in another couple of years and give us another 20 examples, and then 30, and then 100. And then by the time we've got 100, we'll have a pretty good idea on how to do this. So look to each of those other disciplines for that same type of guidance. And we all suffer from the same thing. We are a supporting process to the organizational goal achievement process. And we all need to be participating and cooperating. And one of the things you can point out to them is that many organizations do this. Let me give you another example. I was working for a very large organization at one point that had a very large telecommunications infrastructure. And they had a large number of people who kept track of where the wires and the wireless units came into and who had access to what, and what PCs were connected to the network and all this sort of thing. It was a very, very sophisticated operation. And out of about 100 network technicians, about 10 of them, in fact, kept track of the metadata of where all this stuff was going. And they had very sophisticated systems to do this. And then I turned around and said, and now you've got 3 people keeping track of the rest of your data. They kind of went, ooh, okay, good point. It's probably not the right number because we have a lot more data than we have data about how our telecommunications assets are used. So maybe we should put some more effort into that as well. And again, the leveraging there was that they ended up being able to do about 10 people were able to get a lot more of their data managed well than had been previously. They're not going to make any claims that they're fully compliant with all of these things, but they're certainly doing better. So again, great question, and good to point out those other disciplines that are just as key as these are.
Okay, great. And the next question is, Peter, in your book, are there sample proposals for DM initiatives?
Ooh, I'm sorry. No, it's a great idea. I wish I'd thought of that myself. You know, I did see one. I guess no, there's none in there. That would have been a great idea, but it's really a business case type scenario. So that would have been a great idea. I wish we thought of that a year ago when we were working on the book. Great suggestion. Maybe if you write one up and come up with a template, you'd be willing to contribute it.
Okay, and the next question is, are you sure that data is non-degradable? If backups and media transfer of historic data is not adequate at vast quantities of, is not adequate? Is that a word that you recognize?
Absolutely, and again, the question is very, very good. So we go back to the statement that I make just about every time I get in front of a group and say that data is our sole, non-depletable, non-degrading, durable strategic asset. Now, that doesn't mean it can't degrade, but data that is well maintained does not degrade. The real problem for most organizations is that they have trouble separating the wheat from the chaff in there. So absolutely, you can put data on a media. That there was a terrific John Oliver this last year. I don't know how many of you saw it, but one of the things he points out is that our nuclear capability, you know, the ICBMs, the 4,000 or so that are pointed to various parts of the globe that we might want to blow up if we get mad enough to do that, are controlled by 8-inch floppies. Now, I don't even have any 4-inch floppies or 3.5-inch floppies that are still in good shape anymore. How the military is managing to maintain our nuclear warhead collection using 8-inch floppy disks is a very scary proposition. So absolutely, I'll take your point that data on a media can degrade, but well cared for data does not degrade. And so it may mean moving it from media to media. The data I consider to be separate from the media. Again, look at the other things I have on the chart here. Your physical assets can be used up or they can be invested to produce more. That's a choice that you make every day when you spend money or invest money. Real estate, however, in general does not improve over time. It tends to degrade. And your inventory, if you have that up, again, if you just store it, I mentioned the tanks that I was talking about for that one organization. Those tanks, just by sitting there, degraded. Even though they were not out in the weather or anything else, just not moving the tanks becomes a problem. So diesel engines have to be started up and run on a regular basis or else they will degrade on time. So point well taken, the media that the data is on can degrade over time and it can be a problem, but data itself as an asset well cared for is the only asset that you have that you cannot use up. You can use it more and more, and that's getting better leverage. That it doesn't degrade as an asset over time, and it is a durable asset in that it lasts more than a year in length, and it's strategic in that most organizations don't recognize that because of those other 4 properties, it has more unique capabilities than any other part of your system. Great question.
All right, it actually looks like that's all we have for today. So thank you everyone for participating in today's event. We hope you've enjoyed it.
Thanks too fast.
Thanks again to DATAVERSITY. And Shannon for hosting us. Once again, we will receive today's materials within the next 2 business days. Our webinar next month will be Go Small Before Going Big with Data, a framework for implementing NoSQL and Hadoop. Hopefully you'll be able to join us for that as well. As always, feel free to contact us if you have any questions. Thanks everyone and have an awesome day.
Thanks Megan. Thanks Shannon.
Thank you for another great presentation. Thanks, Megan. Thanks, everyone.